The Nazi war machine had run rampant over Europe, and North Africa was next. But an island of resistance stood in the way, defended by a handful of RAF pilots and planes that became the stuff of legend.
Malta, this tiny little dot in the middle of the Mediterranean, absolutely holds the key to success in North Africa.
Outnumbered and outgunned, the island defenders were inspired by a maverick Spitfire pilot who cut a swathe through the legions of Hitler's Luftwaffe.
He was the most authentic fighter pilot on our side of the war. He was unique.
He relished it. He went into battle expecting to win, and he did.
He was in a class by himself, as far as I was concerned.
But the man who became one of the greatest Allied aces of the war had a wild side that couldn't be tamed.
He is a really mean, lean killing machine.
Malta was besieged, and much of it bombed to ruins when a Canadian pilot landed at a makeshift airfield. George Beurling was one of 32 Spitfire pilots, drafted in to mount a last-ditch defense of the tiny Mediterranean island. A strategic stepping stone between Europe and the desert battlefields of North Africa, Malta had to be held at all costs.
It's absolutely essential that we don't surrender it, that we don't lose Malta. So both sides, the Axis are absolutely determined to take it for that reason, and the British are absolutely determined not to lose it for the same reason. By the middle of 1942, Malta is the most bombed place on Earth. In 2 months, more bombs fall on Malta than on London in the entire Blitz.
They were trying to destroy Spitfires on the ground.
The Germans aimed to pound the island into submission before landing an invasion force. Ian McLennan was another Spitfire pilot, dodging bombs and bullets on Malta.
And sometimes you're sitting there waiting to take off in your aircraft, and the bastards are coming over. They're still not letting you off. You think you're going to get hit by bombs or straight by 109s.
Under constant attack and short on fuel, food, and ammunition, it was a nightmare posting. But for a pilot who relished a fight and loathed the rules and regulations of home base, Malta was a chance to let instinct fly. Born in Montreal in 1921, George Beurling was captivated by aviation at an early age.
At the age of 9, he suddenly becomes obsessed with flying. He lives fairly near this airfield, and he starts seeing them, and he thinks, that's the life for me. I want to be an aviator. I want to be a pilot. If you're a young boy growing up in the 1930s, your point of reference is the First World War and the great fighter races, and it's that combination that he's very excited about. It's a combination of shooting and flying. Anyone can fly, anyone can shoot, but can you do the two things together? And that's what most people can't do, and it's one thing he's absolutely determined to become an absolute ace at.
Hitler's pursuit of another world war gave the young Canadian a chance to fulfill his childhood dream.
He thinks, I want a piece of this. This is great, because this is where I can be a proper pilot. Not only can I fly planes, I can also shoot down other planes.
Younger brother Rick remembered his teenage brother's desperation to join the Commonwealth forces in the fight.
My dad went with him to the recruitment center, and they said, no, you're too young, and furthermore, you have to finish your high school before we'll look at you. So he said to Dad that he said, well, I'm going to go to England and join the RAF.
He goes on a merchant ship all the way across the Atlantic. The convoys were easy meat, and just as they're approaching Ireland, he's coming under an attack by a U-boat, and where large numbers of that formation are being sunk. He then gets to Glasgow, jumps ship, goes to an RAF recruiting officer, and the RAF recruiting officer says to him, "I'm really sorry, you don't have a birth certificate."
The young Canadian was sent back into the U-boat-infested Atlantic.
He eventually gets back to home to Montreal, and his mother goes, "George, where have you been?" He said, "Well, I've been to Glasgow to try and join up in the RAF, but I didn't have my birth certificate." And he goes all the way back on the same ship, back over to Glasgow. And the RAF recruiting officer goes, "Well, have you got them now?" And he says, "Yes."
George Beurling began operational training at an RAF base in North Wales. His instructor wasn't much older, 21-year-old Battle of Britain veteran Tony Pickering.
We realised he was an excellent pilot. He probably only flew a few hours on a Spitfire. He was flying it just as if he'd been born with a Spitfire. He could operate that Spitfire quicker and more efficiently than any other trainee pilot I ever knew.
Accomplished in the air, the young Canadian had a turbulent time with superior officers on the ground.
The people further back, your wingman.
George was always hanging loose, never buttoned up, scarf round his neck, no tie. He wasn't an example for good discipline. You could sense he was somebody different. The only thing George ever thought about was how to become a fighter pilot, a good fighter pilot.
The trainee's accuracy was tested with a dummy target towed behind another aircraft.
Good shot, sir, and down he comes.
George Beurling was uncannily accurate, easily outshooting his battle-experienced instructors.
Bring him in, boy. He's done a good job.
He used to come back after firing and he'd say, "You'll find 65 holes in the drogue."
The score?
About 65.
Can't be.
George was very, very accurate. He knew exactly how many of them had hit the drogue. He could have taught me a lot, I can tell you. Oh, exceptional, exceptional. I couldn't have done it like that, nor could anybody else on the station.
The Canadian trainee qualified in just 3 months, finishing top of his class. He was hurled into action, posted to 41 Squadron Sussex, and in March 1942, deployed on the dangerous mission of escorting bombers over Nazi-occupied France. His childhood dream had come true at the controls of a state-of-the-art supermarine Spitfire. He soon scored his first kill. A Fokker-Wulf 190 fighter. But his lust for combat landed him in hot water. Fellow pilot Donald Loudman recalled how George Beurling repeatedly broke formation without permission in the hunt for blood.
Pilots in a squadron become very close. They're your buddies. They're there to help, to protect, to do the job that you're assigned to do. As a result of this, you get to be very close to them. Not only while you're flying, but you do the same sort of things on the ground. But there's no George Beurling around. He's gone somewhere or doing something else. He was a loner. He wasn't with us.
Being an individual, being a lone wolf is seriously frowned upon, no matter how good you are as a pilot. And so Beurling always, from the outset, from the moment he arrives in England, is always an outsider. He's always a misfit. He doesn't quite toe the line.
Let's get started, shall we, gentlemen? I want you to listen, and listen very carefully. What I'm about to tell you may just keep you alive.
He was a natural pilot, but his untamed talent meant little to the sticklers for discipline among the officer class of the RAF.
You're all listening carefully. Jolly good. Then I will proceed. I want there to be no mistakes this time, Mr. Beurling.
He's seen as an outsider, an eccentric, someone who doesn't want to play ball.
So let me just reiterate once again, flying in Vic formation.
No matter how good he is as a pilot, he's the new boy. He's put at the tail end of a formation when they first go over. It's tail end Charlie.
Tail end Charlie. That would be you, Mr. Beurling.
Yes, sir.
Tail end Charlie was the most vulnerable position in an attack, but the brilliant yet ill-disciplined flyer would not be brought down.
Okay, I want you to be the eyes and ears of your squadron.
He wanted to do it his way on his own, and the heck with these rules that other people have laid down.
A young, unpopular and unorthodox Spitfire pilot, George Beurling, was demoted to the vulnerable tail of a bomber escort formation over occupied France.
Blue 4, bandits at 2 o'clock, high.
His sharp eyes spotted German planes his fellow RAF pilots couldn't see. Bob Middlemas was one of them.
He spotted some 109s at 2 o'clock high, reported to the wing commander, and there was nothing we could see. The wing commander asked, did he still have them in sight?
Yes, sir, 2 o'clock high, closing. There's nothing there, damn you. Get off the radio.
And that's when, unbeknownst to us, he just peeled off.
The Canadian abandoned his tail position without permission, leaving his fellow pilots vulnerable to attack. But his eyes hadn't let him down. The lone wolf closed in on a squadron of German fighters.
Beurling does have very, very good eyesight, but what he's done and what other pilots don't do is he's trained himself to be able to pick out objects in the sky before anyone else. And the reason he's done that is by this process of scanning, which is now completely standard practice if you're a pilot. The point is, if you start fixing on a particular object, your eyes focus, and then they've got to unfocus and focus on something else. So he's learned how to pick up objects by doing this sweeping where you look across and you go, you don't, and you sweep back again, and then you sweep across, but not at exactly the same height as the previous sweep.
Banking his Spitfire around, he zeroed in on the leader of a pack of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. The rest of his squadron was unaware, unable to see him. He had vanished and was presumed missing in action.
We did our trip, came back, no Beurling, so we thought, just lost another one. And then suddenly over the aerodrome comes this Spitfire. When he landed, he said he had shot down a 109 from some special angle. I think we all thought, well, here's a Sprague pilot trying to make a name for himself.
Already infamous for his shabby dress and ill discipline, the Canadian upstart was hauled before his superiors. He had to justify deserting his squadron over enemy territory.
Take a seat, Beurling.
He hoped a gun camera fitted to his Spitfire would do just that.
Beurling shoots down this plane, but when they go and look at his gun camera, there's no evidence of any plane being shot down whatsoever because they just simply can't see it.
The film was blank. Superior officers took a dim view of bogus claims and apparent insubordination.
It's about the tea.
The flight commanders, I don't think really trusted George in the air. George wanted to be on his own, not flying in a formation with 12 other airplanes.
George Beurling was grounded. But even on the ground, he was able to hone his killer instincts.
George would be sitting outside the dispersal hut. His hands would suddenly clench. And then a few seconds later, up they would go. He was practicing deflection shooting on a bird.
Deflection shooting is the art of estimating exactly where a moving target will be when the bullets hit.
When he started, you couldn't see anything at all, but within a couple of seconds, say very short, you suddenly see a crow or a starling. It had to be a fast bird, something was flying fast. Seagull, something which was moving, and George would follow it through. It got the deflection right, down it would come in his imagination. Down it would come. Nobody else would know, but George was doing that, practicing deflection shooting all the time.
Beurling is one of very, very few pilots that masters deflection shooting. And that's very, very hard to do because you've got to take into account the speed you're going, the speed your enemy is going, the speed of the bullets, and the fall-off of the bullets, because, of course, bullets don't stay at the same height that you're firing them.
It explained why the sky in front of his gun camera seemed empty. It recorded the spot where the German plane would be struck by bullets before it actually happened.
If you've already got a guy who's a bit weird, a bit of an outsider, and he's then claiming he's shooting down planes with amazing deflection, which almost no one can do, and there is no evidence of doing it, then he becomes even more of an outsider than he already is. It's a sort of vicious circle. He's a troublemaker. He doesn't toe the line. He's not part of the squadron. He's a lone wolf, and that's when he says to his CEO, look, please get me out of here, get me a transfer anywhere.
The maverick pilot soon got the chance to spread his wings. A married officer was horrified when his posting came through to the hell of Malta. The young Canadian volunteered to take his place. In June 1942, George Beurling was sent into the maelstrom of the savage, bloody battle for Malta.
It was the key to that whole area. A, because of the activities on this north shore of the Med involving Italy and Mussolini and company, and also in North Africa, where General Rommel was going full bore.
Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps was poised to take control of the Suez Canal and key oil fields in the Middle East. It was vital that the battered British garrison on Malta held on to the strategic stepping stone.
Malta stood between occupied Europe and Rommel's Africa Corps. Allied high command were terrified that Rommel would be able to move east, capture the oil fields, and eventually join up with the German army in Eastern Europe. It was up to pilots such as Beurling to keep the Germans out of Malta, so that the Allies could threaten Rommel's supply lines.
But although the island was still in British hands, getting there involved a long and perilous trip. From Gibraltar, George Beurling and others were ferried by aircraft carrier into the western Mediterranean. From there, it was an 800-mile flight across enemy-infested skies. Pilot Bob Middlemiss was on the same trip.
As we approached the island, we were intercepted by 109s from Sicily. And so we had to fight our way in. One of our chaps in our section of 4 was shot down. Of the 31 that took off from the carrier, 27 arrived.
George Beurling was among the survivors who made it to Malta. The garrison needed every pilot and plane it could muster.
Sir.
The island's squadron leader, Laddie Lucas, was well aware of the young Canadian's troubled past.
Laddie thought he would disrupt the whole squadron, you see, with his goings-on. He obviously had no idea of discipline or anything. But Laddie could handle him.
How was your journey?
On Malta, skill and courage were more important than etiquette. Unlike some of his fellow officers back in Britain, squadron leader Laddie Lucas recognized and respected raw talent.
So what made you decide to come here?
I want to fly planes and shoot down Germans, sir.
Okay. We'll take you.
Thank you, boss.
George, Beurling and Laddie got on very well because I think that Beurling respected Laddie's very much. Laddie thought that he was the most fantastic pilot, incredibly brave and shooting down all these planes. It was something any commander, squadron commander would love to have. So they did all right.
Just 3 days after his arrival, the Canadian was called into action.
Scramble!
He and 3 other pilots intercepted 15 Messerschmitt 109s. Armed with cannons and machine guns, the formidable Me-109s matched the Spitfires in speed and handling. They also outnumbered the RAF pilots by more than 3 to 1. Yet George Beurling still blasted one of them out of the sky and made it back to claim his first kill over Malta. But far sterner threats lay over the horizon. Weeks later, waves of hundreds of Axis fighters and bombers closed in on Malta, aiming to wipe the RAF off the island. George Beurling and his fellow pilots had less than 100 planes to fight with. Once again, the RAF was vastly outnumbered by 4 to 1. To have any chance of surviving and fighting back, they had just 90 seconds to get airborne. On the ground, they were sitting ducks, but in the air, their Spitfires could climb 3,000 feet a minute, giving them the decisive advantage of height.
You all hunt together in the Malta formations, and it was disciplined. You were bloody well expected to do what you were told to do, and break when we were told to break, not before that.
But once again, the Canadian Maverick broke the rules and formation, and single-handedly swooped into a clutch of Italian bombers.
I think he was impatient. I think he thought, why the hell am I here? I can go out there and kill some bloody Germans. Let me go. And he did. Being in a dogfight suggests that it's a fight to the death, and it probably is. You don't want to get hit. You're trying to outsmart the son of a bitch and get inside him. It's instinctive. You can't be trained not to be scared.
His first target was a 3-engine Italian Cant bomber. The pilot wiped out with a burst of fire into the cockpit. He then went after the fighters, hitting the fuel tank of an Italian Macchi that burst into a ball of flame. George Beurling scored a hat-trick when he sent another Macchi plunging into the sea.
He shoots down 3 confirmed and 1 probable on that day alone. Now, to put that in some perspective, only about 10% of fighter pilots ever get to a stage in their entire flying careers where they've got 5 confirmed kills.
It seemed too good to be true, but Beurling's deadly instincts in the air were proven on the ground.
When he was talking to the intelligence officer and recounting what he'd done, there was one case where he said, I shot a Messerschmitt 109, I hit it on a deflection shot, I came in at an angle, and I hit it above the starboard root wing, got it in the engine just beyond the cockpit. And the intelligence officer says, well, I'm really sorry, no one can confirm that, so I'll just have to put it down as a probable. Later that day, a report comes in of a Messerschmitt having crashed, somewhere on the south of the island near the Dingley Cliffs or something. And they come in and they go, Yeah, and it was shot all the way just along above the starboard wing, you know, exactly where Beurling had said it was. And he got his confirmed kill.
He'd already shot down 3 enemy planes, but there was barely time to refuel before crack Canadian pilot George Beurling was sent back up.
You're looking for the Germans, and the first thing you see are little specks. And that's the fighters. They're ahead of the bombers. And that's the enemy. Well, he used to see before anybody else saw.
2 formidable Messerschmitt 109s were closing in from behind. But the eagle-eyed aviator saw them first, turned, and fired from what was thought to be an impossible range.
He shoots down a Messerschmitt 109 from 800 yards. I really can't impress upon you strongly enough just how extraordinary that shot is. Effective range really is only about 450 yards. To shoot something at 800 yards, that's almost half a mile. A plane at half a mile is a pinprick.
It would prove to be one of the most extraordinary aerial kills in the war.
Nice work, Sergeant.
Unconformist and insubordinate, it was his exceptional talent that made him a star in the skies over Malta.
Malta, because of the unique situation of it being small, being so undersupplied, because the normal decorum, the normal spit and polish, the normal kind of ethics which are absolutely imbued within anyone who's in the RAF have gone out the window. Someone like Beurling, who is a complete maverick, a complete oddball and eccentric, this is a place where he can thrive. It's his kind of environment.
There was no room for snobbery in the desperate do-or-die battle over the ruins of Malta. It was results that mattered most. And against all odds, George Beurling's 249 Squadron was beating the Axis back.
For the first time in his life, really, Beurling starts making friendships with people his same age, his contemporaries, in a way that he hasn't done before.
Accepted and admired by his fellow pilots, the young Canadian was still a bit of a loner. A committed Christian who didn't drink, he stayed on base whilst his comrades let off steam in the bars and brothels of Valletta. He spent his time honing his deadly skills for the next battle ahead.
He would just spend his time honing his skills. So he would continue practicing his sweeping, he would kill flies. There were also a large number of stray dogs around, and he used to practice shooting them through the eyes with his pistol, which is quite hard because pistols don't have, particularly revolvers, don't have great range, but he would always do it. And this was another way of improving his marksmanship. He would work out things that could improve his performance, and he would make notes about sorties he'd been on. He had all these formulae which he could call upon, but he had honed them so well that after a while it just became instinctive, that he could make the mental calculation in the nanosecond that was required.
The Spitfire's 4 machine guns were calibrated to converge on a deadly sweet spot some 320 meters away. George Beurling had his guns readjusted, so the stream of bullets would meet 100 meters closer in. Only a limited amount of ammunition could be loaded into the wings, enough for just 5 3-second bursts. The Canadian reckoned that the closer he got, the fewer bullets he'd need, and the more kills he could make.
You're closing. You hold off, you hold off, you hold off until you get on top of them, and then you press the button.
Beurling proved that you could not have to waste ammunition. He could maybe fire 2 shells, and the poor chap in the other airplane was no longer there.
Because he only ever requires a 1 or 2 second burst, his guns don't jam. So if you've got best part of 15 seconds worth of ammunition, he can make every one of those 15 seconds count in a way that the vast majority of fighter pilots can't.
You don't want to waste what limited ammunition that you have on board, because when it's gone, you're no longer a fighter pilot. You're just a rider in an airplane.
George Beurling made a final ingenious adjustment. Usually, every fourth bullet was a bright phosphorus tracer to help pilots take aim. But the Maverick flyer trusted his keen eyesight and asked his armorers to replace the tracers with normal rounds. It meant that the enemy couldn't see them either. His Spitfire was soon adorned with 17 confirmed kills. News of his exploits spread, and the man who had defied the orders and the etiquette of senior rank was himself promoted to the officer class. Fellow pilot Bob Middlemiss remembered the Maverick's reaction.
Beurling dashes in off the aerodrome in short pants, covered with dust, sweaty as anything. And of course, Beurling said he didn't want a commission. The airmen won't look up to me then, all this saluting.
Typically, he did not conform and refused to wear his officer's uniform, preferring to show his class in the cockpit of his trusty Spitfire.
By the end of July, his score is rapidly mounting. He managed to shoot down 4 in one day. One of the people he shoots down is a key Italian commander. He is a really, really mean, lean killing machine.
I think he loved rushing off and shooting them all down because he didn't seem to have any fear. He was only interested in flying and fighting and shooting. And that was what had consumed his whole being while he was there.
Despite George Beurling's triumphs in one-to-one combat, his comrades were fighting a losing battle. Many did not make it back.
These losses invariably took one of your buddies with them. It's not something you could do anything about. You were fighting to avoid that, but it happened. It was tough when you'd lose a good buddy, and we saw that happen all too often.
Well, I think the most frightened I was someone would be screaming at me. I think when I'm flying along, the worst I think I've had scares. I've been flying along and somebody says, "Break!" You knew that someone was trying to kill you right away, so you went into a dive, into a spiraling dive, not trying to find out who he was, what he was, do a really remarkable escape job.
Allied pilots were outnumbered and running out of critical supplies, ammunition, planes, and manpower. A blockade enforced by Axis warships was starving Malta into submission.
The Navy had gone because they simply were just being sunk one after the other. There was a complete blockade, running out of aeroplanes, running out of oil, out of petrol, practically nothing to eat. It was absolutely awful.
It was a tough island. Towards the end, the Malta people were nearly starving to death. We were hungry all the time. We really were. And we got better food than they did, I'm sure. We had corned beef canned in 1919 in South America. I can taste corned beef for years after. There was a thing that a lot of us got, perhaps all of us did from time to time, was Malta dog, which is a form of dysentery. And it was messy, and it could be so messy you couldn't fly.
Malta Dog did what no Axis pilot could do. and brought down George Beurling. The entire island was ill, facing terminal defeat. The Allied High Command administered a desperate last-ditch resuscitation. Operation Pedestal. 14 cargo ships loaded with food, fuel, and ammunition were hurled at the enemy blockade, choking Malta. But their escort of battleships and destroyers could not ward off waves of aerial attack. One by one, the Allied freighters were sunk. The massive oil tanker, Ohio, was a key target for German planes.
It gets repeatedly attacked, repeatedly hit. At one point, a Stuka actually crash lands on its deck and explodes, but it doesn't blow up. It's absolutely dead in the water.
5 of the original 14 cargo ships limped into Valletta Harbor, including the stricken Ohio. The life-saving supplies meant that Malta could fight on for a while longer, a desperately needed boost in material and morale.
Just as it's coming into Grand Harbour, Beurling, the great ace, the one that everyone knows on the island, flies up the length of Grand Harbour in his Spitfire upside down.
But Malta was still in dire straits, and the Germans and their Italian Axis allies regrouped to launch a decisive knockout blow from the air. It would prove to be a fateful battle for the young, unorthodox ace, George Beurling. He'd notched up 24 kills, more than any other pilot in Malta. In October 1942, the Luftwaffe led another devastating mass raid on Malta. It was around lunchtime when George Beurling and his fellow pilots were scrambled to meet the waves of enemy raiders closing in. Aircraft filled the sky. It seemed that pilots were more likely to crash into each other than get shot at in a maelstrom of men and machines. Beurling's first target was a German Junkers 88 bomber about to unload. He had one of its 2 engines in his sights.
But just as he's done that, he sees one of his colleagues in trouble with a Messerschmitt 109 on his tail. So he hares after his mate.
Distracted, the Canadian ace didn't see the Ju-88's rear gunner taking aim at him.
One of the rear gunners on the burning bomber opens fire and hits him a couple of times.
Wounded, he plunged his Spitfire into a steep dive to escape. But 2 Messerschmitt 109s were lining up on his tail to finish him off. Hit in the leg and bleeding heavily, he threw his plane around, not to escape, but to turn the tables on his attackers. He spotted another Me-109 closing in on a fellow pilot and took deadly aim. But the Spitfires were outnumbered, and another German fighter was quickly on his tail.
In that moment, Beurling gets hit by a 109 himself, and this time by a cannon shell. And he bails out. He has to bail out. He can't go on. He's badly, badly wounded.
Having beaten the overwhelming odds against him for 20 weeks, the Spitfire ace was out of luck. Dangling on the end of a parachute, one of the greatest Allied aces of the war was helpless. But just as a German plane closed in to finish him off, a Spitfire flew in to the rescue. George Beurling and his RAF comrades were grossly outnumbered, yet managed to destroy around half of the Axis planes sent to wipe them out. The brave defenders of Malta landed a stunning counterblow that forced Hitler to change tactics.
Hitler says, no, we'll hold off on Malta, let's go for Egypt. Hitler's more of a land warfare man. He doesn't like the idea of airborne or seaborne invasions. And so that one golden opportunity to really invade Malta goes.
The lifting of the siege of Malta has always struck me as one of those turning points of the Second World War. Before, the Allies were on the back foot. Afterwards, they appeared to be on their way to victory.
After months of recuperation, George Beurling returned to Canada a hero. The air ace who led the fight back that broke the siege of Malta. But the solitary young man, dubbed the Falcon of Malta, was not suited to public relations and yearned to be back in the air.
He was just 20 years old when he came back a hero. And he was put into the spotlight every place that he went, and it was not a place that he felt comfortable. The intent of the Air Force at that time was to put him on a bond tour across Canada, and he had to be making speeches. He didn't cope with that very well. I know he didn't like it. He wanted to get back to action.
Because he turned and looked at me just as I had a bead on him. I could see all the details in his face. One of my cannon shells cut him right in the face and blew his head right off.
He's very uncomfortable in that public glare, and he starts being a little bit too graphic about the descriptions of killing Italians and Germans over Malta.
The body slumped that side, and the slipstream cut the neck bone, the stub of the neck. Anyway, the blood just streamed down the side of the cockpit. The only time, I'll tell you, it gives you a feeling of satisfaction, you know, when you actually blow their brains out.
What he had seen in Malta, I'm sure, troubled him a lot. I can remember him speaking about a little girl that he saw just wandering on the street, and she had part of her one arm blown off and the other arm was just hanging. And that disturbed him a great deal.
Without a war to fight, the air ace drifted aimlessly until a new conflict beckoned in the Middle East.
In 1947, Israel is looking for people, mercenaries effectively, who will come and help them in the war against Palestine. Beurling is one of the people that's contacted, and he immediately puts his hand up. At last, here is the opportunity for combat flying again. He doesn't care who he's flying against, he doesn't care who he's flying with. The important thing is that he's given that chance to do combat flying once more.
In May 1948, he'd swapped a Spitfire for a Norseman transport plane, bound for Tel Aviv. While on approach for a stop at Rome, his plane exploded in a fireball, a freak accident that finally felled the Falcon of Malta. In a short yet stunning career as a combat pilot, George Beurling scored 31 kills. He was just 26 when his last flight ended in a fatal crash.
Beurling's complete purpose of life was to be a fighter pilot. That's all he was interested in. And what he had was enormous skills and agility in the air, phenomenal eyesight, and superb marksmanship. And those three factors made him stand out in the top 0.5% of the pilots of the war.
George Beurling's contribution to the war was extremely important. He destroyed a lot of enemy aircraft. He helped to a very large degree to deflect, halt, prevent the invasion of Malta and hence Southern Europe.
George, in my opinion, was the finest fighter pilot, and I went all through the war as a fighter pilot. I met some very distinguished fighter pilots. But George was my number one.
History Night is back next Tuesday night from 8. After the break, Nazi Secrets investigates the tragic tales of Hitler's damned women.